Today on the show, I have Gordon Strong, who's the three-time Ninkasi Award winner. He's the president of the BJCP. He's also the author of the new book, Brewing Better Beer. Gordon, it's great to have you on the show.
Hey, it's great to be back, Brad. Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about English Porter, which is one of my favorite beer styles, and I think it's one of yours as well.
It is.
Can you start with a little bit of the history behind Porter?
Sure. It's shrouded in a little bit of mystery, actually. And some of the stories that are out there are pretty much acknowledged to be incorrect. So I'll try to get it right as far as we know now. It's a style that developed in London in the early 1700s, basically growing out of a kind of brown beer that they brewed at the time that tended to be sweeter. They added some more hops to it, and so they could store it longer. And it really caught on among the manual laborers in London at the time. There was quite the industry, and people hauling around goods and such from the river, from the markets, and those people were called porters. So the beer was really named after the laboring class that enjoyed it so much. And it really grew throughout the 1700s. Towards the end of the 1700s, early 1800s, it was really a widely exported style. There were big London breweries. Perhaps 75% of the beer production in London was from porter brewers. These big breweries often focused exclusively on porters. So very, very popular style.
So it was sort of the Budweiser of its time, is that right?
Yeah, except it tasted like something.
Tasted like something, yeah. Now, a lot of people don't know that it has a lot of different styles to it. There's a lot of sub-styles to porter. Can you go over some of those sub-styles for a minute?
Sure. It's some of those are more or less BJCP constructs to help competitions run more smoothly. The BJCP defines three different porter substyles. There's brown porter, which is more or less the English style of porter. There's robust porter, which I guess you could call an American style porter, hoppier, more bitter, more dark grain character. And then there's a stronger porter in many of the Eastern European countries, known as Baltic porter. And it's actually what I'm drinking right now.
That looks pretty good.
It tastes pretty good too.
Yeah.
Focusum from Poland.
So if you want to brew a great English porter, how would you start? What kind of grain bill would you use to get started here?
I think this is sort of my personal opinion, is that you probably only need 3-4 grains for a good porter. I would always start with a good English base malt, Maris Otter type malt. Perhaps 70-80% of the grist. I think it's important to have some crystal malt in there for sweetness, maybe 10, 12, 13%. And chocolate malt is pretty important. I would use somewhere in the 5 to 8% range. Then you have a little bit of variation depending on which way you want to go. I kind of like a little bit of brown malt in there, anywhere from 10 to 15%. But you can also use some black malt. I tend to use somewhere down around 2 or 3%. So you need a solid base malt. You need some chocolate. You need some crystal, and then you need something that's going to give it a little bit of a deeper flavor.
Now, do you use a lot of roast barley or roasted malt, black patent malt, or do you try and stay away from that?
Honestly, I never use roast barley in a porter. I save those for stouts. Um, I'll use black malt sometimes, and that's why I said, I might use 2 or 3%. Um, but that's in like a brown porter or in a beer that would sort of fit in between a English style and an American style porter. Um, I don't like my porters to have a significant hoppy character. I like it to be a malty beer. So I don't like the bitterness to dominate. I like it to have enough bitterness that it's not sweet, but I don't want a big late hop character because I actually want to taste those grains. So that's pretty much how I go. I took a look at um, I pulled out some recipe logs in preparation for this, and I looked at maybe 10 different porters that I've made, and I tried to do the designing great beer thing of looking at incidence of use and the percentage of the grains, and that's sort of what I was giving you. So I wrote it out on a sheet of paper, and
Fantastic.
so
Now you mentioned the use of brown malt, which I think is kind of an interesting ingredient. A lot of the earliest brown malts were actually kilned over wood because in the early 1700s they didn't really have coke-fired kilns and all that other stuff. It wasn't until much later.
right.
But brown malt even these days is somewhat hard to find sometimes. What does brown malt really add to a porter?
Well, I used some in the last batch that I made. It's actually in the carboy right now. Um, so I mean, I can just took a hydrometer sample before here, so I could taste it and see if I could describe it to you. It's
So you have a sample right there. You're going to taste on the air. Gordon is tasting the sample for those of you on the radio.
Yeah, it's kind of a unique flavor. I think I'd describe it as a sort of a cross between a biscuit malt and a very light chocolate malt. It's sort of it's it's like bread crusts, I guess, or toasted bread crust. It doesn't have that grainy, biting quality that a biscuit malt can have. It's starting to get a little bit of a light chocolatey character, but not that much. So I think it adds a really interesting flavor, sort of like a dark Munich malt would add to some of the European styles. I think it's an interesting character grain, and you actually you can find it. It might be a special order. You might have to mail order it, but English maltsters are making it. I checked online. I see you can buy crisp brown malt from Northern Brewer and places like that. So I would go out and look for it. I think it's an interesting addition. In this last batch I made, which was about a 6-gallon batch, I used 1.5 pounds of brown malt, which wound up being I don't know, about 12% of the grist, I think. So I would check it out. And actually, it's sort of interesting that you brought up the historical nature of brown malt, because when I was mentioning the history of porters, there were these brown beers that were made in London, and at the time they were made from 100% brown malt, the kind of malt that you were talking about. But that brown malt is different than today's brown malt, because that early brown malt actually still had some diastatic power, so it could convert itself.
Mm-hmm.
Modern brown malt has no diastatic power, so you have to mash it with something else that has enzymes, or use it as a kind of a steeping grain.
Now, a lot of
So, people hypothesize certainly that early brown malts would have had a smoky character because it was dried over a wood fire. So if you wanted to simulate that, I might use a little bit of rock malt um, in my beer, on the order of, I don't know, less than 5%. I would stay away from peat malt entirely. You use the German beechwood smoked rock malt.
now a lot of people like to throw everything but the kitchen sink into their porter. In fact, you see a lot of porters titled kitchen sink porter, and they throw Munich malt and wheat
Sure.
malt and all kinds of things into it. What do you think of that approach, Gordon?
Um, I've made some of those. I've looked on this list I have. I've got 16 different malts on this list. So
Hmm.
between 10 or 11 beers, I mean, the different recipes have called for those in different combinations. I think the most I ever had in one was maybe um, 8 or 9, maybe. So, you know, depends on what you're using. I mean, I break the malts into different groups. So, I mean, you have like the base malts. So you can use Maris Otter, and um, I think of the base malts you use, I think Maris Otter needs to be at least half of what you allocate towards the base malts. So you can add some Munich, you can add some Vienna, you can add some aromatic, depending on how much you want to punch up the malt. So, I mean, sometimes I'm looking for that in different styles. They'll tend to not attenuate quite as much. So, if you want something with a little bit more residual sweetness, with a little bit more malty flavor, then you can go that route. That's also not a bad plan if you're going to add smoke or more of the highly roasted grains, because the richness would tend to balance out the darker character. So, I think I've definitely used Munich, Vienna, and aromatic in addition to Maris Otter, but I've always had Maris Otter as at least half of that collection of base malts. And like I said before, typically the base malts are 70 to 80% of the grist. Then there's the crystal malts that you can use. And like I said, I tend to be in the 10 to 13% range there. In a 5-gallon batch, that's a pound to a pound and 3/4.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm talking about medium crystals there. I'm talking about in the 40 to 80 Lovibond range. I prefer to use English crystal malts because they tend to be made from 2-row rather than American 6-row. So I think they have a better flavor, and I tend to use the 60 more often. I would say. As far as chocolate, um, um, again, I would use the English malt.
Hmm.
Different maltsters are gonna have the different Lovibond. There's really a big difference. You can get some that are in the mid 300s up to 500 plus. So there is quite a bit of difference, and those are going to have different flavors. So some of the other specialty grains that I've used, I would call the dark crystal family. So like a crystal 120 or a special B, or some that I've used. Um, I tend not to use the light crystals as much. Sometimes I might throw in some Caribbean um, if I'm looking for a little bit more residual sweetness. You might think about adding in, if you want to get more body in your porter, you might add some carapils or some oats or some flaked barley. Um, you could add biscuit malt, you could add kiln coffee malt, you can add these different flavors. You just have to you just have to think how the flavors are going to layer on each other and how they're going to play together. Because it could be like making a chili or a soup or something. If you wind up using every spice in the cabinet, it's just going to wind up tasting muddy. But if you make some smart choices, it could be like a curry where you do use a dozen spices and it winds up tasting wonderful. So if you choose them smartly and you try not to get flavors that clash, I don't mind the kitchen sink approaches, and I actually think it's a style that can take it. So this last batch that I made, for instance, I did throw in a pound of Munich. I'm not looking for a dominant flavor, but I often use a combination of Maris Otter and some German malts in the malt forward English styles that I make. So I think that's a reasonable approach.
Mm-hmm. So you put your grain bill together at this point. What kind of a mash profile would you use for making a good porter here?
It's really simple. So I mean, porter is a great style for both beginning all grain brewers as well as extract brewers. I made it a number of times as an extract brewer, and steep grains and add liquid malt extract, and you're good to go. For an all grain brewer, a single infusion mash, just like the English do, is fine. And honestly, I'm less of the mind that mash temperature is as important as people make it out to be.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you can play around with your mash temperature a lot and see very little difference in the resulting body of the beer. So I tend to mash on the low side, and if I want to add body to my beer, I add a little carapils or something in it. If you're making a style that has a significant quantity of crystal malts in it, you're gonna wind up with some residual body no matter what you do.
Mm-hmm.
So take that into account. So I think you could mash anywhere from the mid 140s to the mid 150s. You want to shoot for an average 151. I looked back at my notes and I tended to be between 151 and 154 on just about every batch.
Sounds reasonable. And then let's go into the boil. How about for hops? What's your favorite hops to use with a porter style?
Honestly, it doesn't much matter because for this kind of style, I almost always just use a bittering hop addition. Late hop additions, yeah, I can put some in there, but it's not going to be prominent. So I tend to stick with English style hops, and with all the darker malts in there, I don't know that you have to go with Goldings. I mean, Goldings are sort of a premium English hop.
Mm-hmm.
I think Fuggles are fine, and or sort of the American version, which is Willamette. That's what I used in my last batch. I looked in my hop freezer and I had a pound of American Willamette hops, and I'm like, well, that'll be perfect. So, I've used a lot of different styles. I would stay away from ones that, if you're making an English style beer, I would stay away from ones that have a big American character, Chinook or anything that's sort of piney or citrusy.
Citrusy, yeah.
I tend to think that those kind of flavors clash with darker malts, so I'd rather not see those. But if you want to add some late hops, you can use the English varieties, or you can actually use some of the German noble varieties too. I think that would be fine if you want to use some late Hallertauer. I think that would be reasonable too.
Do you dry hop at all?
If you want it. I mean, I don't think it has a lot of late hop character. So this last batch I made, I put in 3/4 of an ounce of Fuggles at 10 minutes.
So you don't dry hop a lot either, then I would guess, with this particular style, or do you?
I never dry hop.
Never dry hop. For yeast, what do you do? Do you go with a straight English ale yeast, or you do something a little more complicated?
No, I mean, my favorite yeast for this style is Yeast 1968 or um, the White Labs 002.
Hmm.
Uh, it's basically Fuller's yeast. Um, I love the Fuller's London Porter, so I think it's a yeast that works well with it. If I didn't use that, I would probably look to use Yeast 1318. So I would use a London style yeast. Um, um, but I do tend to keep them cool. This last batch I fermented, I started it at 62. I let it go for several days until it was slowing down, and then I move it to 68 to help it finish.
Now that's pretty low. What does that lower temperature do for you in a porter?
Well, it just gives you a clean profile. I mean, I'm not there's a lot of dark grain in there, so I'm not looking for a lot of yeast character. A little bit of fruit is nice, but sometimes when you drive the English yeasts to warmer temperatures, yeah, you get fruit, but it's often not as clean tasting. So I'm trying to avoid, anything that has sort of an off character. I really want to avoid um, phenolic kind of flavors.
Hmm.
So I like the yeast on the cooler side. I think you pitch a good enough size batch of yeast, it'll tear through it.
So I mean, you really want the grain flavor to come through. What about water profiles? Do you need a London water profile, or do you not worry too much about it?
Um, I I do my water a little bit differently. I go into this in the book for people that want to read about it in detail, but my water is very, very hard. I live in Ohio and we're on top of a huge hunk of limestone. So I buy RO water and I add water salts to that. So typically I will add maybe a teaspoon of calcium chloride in the mash, and I might add maybe a half teaspoon of it in the boil. Um, I adjust my RO water to a pH of 5.5
Hmm.
using phosphoric acid, and that's pretty much how I go. Um, I don't I don't tend to mash the dark grains. I tend to add them in when I'm recirculating. They're basically steeping grains, so they don't need to be in there. So um, if I don't throw the dark grains in the mash, then I don't have to add a lot of calcium carbonate to buffer the pH change during conversion. So that's sort of a technique I'm known for. Um, so I tend to focus more on getting a proper mash pH and less on trying to recreate the historical brewing water.
Hmm. Makes sense. Do you have some recommendations for fermentation and carbonation?
Well, I talked about fermentation temperature.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's true.
really, I tend to keep it on the cool side. Carbonation, it's an English style, and English don't usually highly carbonate their beers. I most often keg my beers, but this beer this style would lend itself to cask conditioning. I do have a pin cask, sort of a half size firkin, um, and I would, if I was going to a winter party or something like that, I would certainly consider putting it in a cask, for presentation value. Um, so keeping the carbonation, average to the light average side, I think is reasonable. It shouldn't have a lot of bubbles to it.
Now, what about serving your porter? You mentioned that you keg most of it, but you have any recommendations for serving it?
Um,
There he
Proper
is.
pint glass.
He's holding up a pint glass for those of you that aren't watching the video.
Um, yeah, if I'm serving it on if I'm serving it from cask, I could serve it on gravity feed or from a beer engine. Um, but porters bottle nicely. If you keg them, like I said, I wouldn't highly carbonate them. I think I think it's certainly in the English style, they like to be able to have a few. So keep that in mind. I think that's what makes the style popular is it has the nice malty flavors, and you can drink several of them.
So can you take a minute to talk about some of the variations that we might try with other porter substyles? You mentioned Baltic and a few of the others, the robust porter.
Yeah, I tend not to make a lot of robust porters. I don't like American hops and dark grains. Um, it's if you want to try a good American porter, the one I really like is Anchor Porter.
Hmm.
If it's kept well. Um, I, when you try a robust porter, pay attention to the roast character. Some of them can be awfully acrid. The best ones will have like a nice roast to it. The worst ones will taste like you're licking an ashtray. So that's not what I'm all about. And pay attention to the level of bitterness. Roasted grains can add bitterness in addition to hops. So watch the contribution of both of those. I think if you start pumping too much hops in there, then you start losing the malt flavor. But a robust porter tends to have more of a roasted quality. Um, it's sort of like the porter version of an American stout. You're trying to get hops and dark grain at the same time. Baltic Porter is a completely different beast entirely. It's a stronger beer. Um, you're talking about something that's between 7 and 9%. It's sort of like oh, it's sort of like a cross between a Doppelbock and a Schwarzbier, I guess. It's um, the Baltic porters today tend to be made as lagers using lager yeast, but they have a ton of rich malt characters. So I would expect brown malt and dark Munich and Cara Munich and things like that in there because you get a complexity of the malt without being overtly roasted. I think if a Baltic porter starts tasting like an imperial stout, it's gone too far. It really needs to stop short of roast, but it needs to have like a lot of complexity and also a lot of a fruity complexity. So I actually think that's sort of an interesting way to get some of that. You can get that from malt, from specialty malts, but you can also get it by driving lager yeast at warmer temperatures.
Interesting. I never thought
So
about using a lager with that particular style.
yeah, like try like Yeast 2206 and ferment it closer to 60 degrees and see what kind of character you get out of it. That's sort of a technique I use when I make like a beer de garde. It's another one that's sort of a malty style that has a fruitiness to it that I tend to think nowadays comes from warm fermented lager yeast than from anything else.
Now, Gordon, I wanted to take just a minute to talk about your new book. When I had you on the show last, you were just getting ready to release it, and of course, you got it launched for the American Homebrewers Conference in June. And so I was wondering if you could just say a few words about the book and how it's doing now that it's out.
Oh, well, thanks. Yeah, Brewing Better Beer. It's gotten some very good reviews. It seems to be popular on Amazon. I know I know we ran through more than a third of the initial printing in the first month it was on sale. It set a pre-sales record with the HA.
Well,
So I'm pretty happy about that.
well, congratulations. But I was going to ask, maybe for those that missed the episode, say 6 months ago when you were on last, if you could just tell people a little bit about what the book is, because I think it fills sort of a unique niche here.
Yeah, the goal of the book was to address how competent all grain brewers advance to the highest level. How do you go beyond being able to competently follow somebody else's recipe, and how do you develop your own style and your own methods? A lot of what I had read about brewing was very formulaic. It made it seem like there was only one way that you could brew beer. But I know so many people that make excellent beer, people that win big competitions, and they all brew differently than I do, and they brew differently from each other. So I was trying to figure out how the top brewers sort of become top brewers, and how do they make their own mark. So I tried to capture a little bit of the process that you go through. It's sort of it's a little bit of Zen-like. It's a personal discovery that you have to go through, because you have to take a lot of your own background and experiences and interests and apply that to the kind of beer you want to make. It's a little bit of a different book in that it's very conversational. I wrote it in sort of the first person, like I'm sitting around talking to you. Actually, what I was thinking when I was writing it was that we were out brewing in my backyard together, and I was answering the questions that people wanted to know. So that's really the kind of book it is. It's a very conversational book. It covers some advanced topics. I designed it for people that already knew something about all grain brewing, but I've since had a number of people tell me that those who are ready to go to all grain can get a lot out of it as well. You don't have to have basically figured out all grain in order to use the book. So while I didn't intend it necessarily that way, that's what people have told me. So I'm happy to hear that it fits a wider audience. So really, the only thing that people had for advanced books were almost like textbooks, and I didn't want to have that. I wanted to have a different way to address what advanced brewers. I wanted a book for people that knew how to make beer.
Mm-hmm. Now, Gordon, is there anything else you'd like to add?
When are you likely to release this? This is going to be out in mid-November?
No, this particular episode will be out probably next week.
Okay. Yeah, I've been invited down to South America, to Brazil and Argentina, and I'm really sort of looking forward to meeting the homebrewers and beer judges down there. They're being involved in the BJCP. We've seen a lot of growth in people around the world that are interested in learning more about beer. So I'm sort of interested in international outreach at the moment. I went to Australia last year and met a lot of great people doing a lot of very interesting and different things. I learned about Galaxy hops before we got them in this country. I got to see people doing brew in a bag, which I'd never heard of before. So I can't wait to see what I learned from people in South America.
Well, thank you, Gordon. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me on. I always have a good time here.
That was Gordon Strong. He's the president of the BJCP. He's a 3-time Ninkasi Award winner, which is the top home brewer in the United States. He's also the author of the new book, Brewing Better Beer. Thanks, Gordon.